But if Josh Strife Hayes' next point holds true, I may be completely wrong. And this is where I may have to disagree with him. Josh Strife Hayes, an absolutely wonderful creator in the MMO content space, had an MMO opinion recently that covered a very prevalent and intriguing question to someone like me, an MMO player and content creator who both enjoyed newer MMOs like New World, Final Fantasy XIV, Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, and also loved some of the older games like Everquest, Ultima Online, Star Wars Galaxies, and World of Warcraft. The question was essentially, why do old school MMOs seem to feel better? And it's a question that is of incredible importance to some games being made today, like Ashes of Creation and Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, both of which will have their own share of classic adversity in different ways. As with most Josh Strife Hayes videos, it is both well-reasoned and understandable, but there is one key point that he mentions that I don't necessarily agree with, but it doesn't take away from the thesis. Why old school MMOs feel better.
Many long-time MMO players fondly reminisce about the days gone when MMOs were far less optimized than they are now, when the games were more of a struggle to play. The old guard complains about today's modern MMO conveniences like tutorials, fast travel, quest markers, minimaps, group finders, and the lack of need to communicate. Many say MMOs have lost the social soul they had so long ago and simply aren't as memorable. However, many of the modern advancements people blame were added as a result of players directly asking for them. Is it possible to design a game to be worse and yet in doing so actually make the player's long-term experience of it better? Can giving the player a less optimized, less immediately fun experience actually result in them remembering the game more fondly, and indeed even recommending it to players precisely because of the fact it is less optimized? The answer is both yes and no. It's a paradox of adversity within game design, and it's one of the main reasons modern MMOs feel the way they do.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am not Josh Strife Hayes, but I do have opinions on MMOs. Quick side note here, I really enjoy Josh Strife Hayes' videos. This is all in jest. Cheers.
I think I've managed to distill it down to the simplest, most base reason. I'm going to call it the paradox of adversity within game design. It's not the catchiest title, I know, but it explains why making something better for the player in the short term can sometimes remove its ability to have a long-term impact. It's all to do with the human experience of overcoming adversity. Consider the following. If something, say a task or a challenge, is immediately easy, it will have a high number of people attempt it and complete it, because it's accessible to a greater number of people. And because a great number of people tend to enjoy easier things, the task will see a relatively high retention rate. On the opposite end of the spectrum are very hard tasks with very high rates of immediate failure, or a great deal of input effort required. Fewer people will even attempt it, let alone succeed. And because people don't enjoy failure, many will quit if the first few attempts don't succeed. The paradox is the immediate reward for the low effort input is never as high or as satisfying as the delayed reward for the high input process. The intensity of the reward and the long-term value of it is directly related to the complexity and difficulty to achieve the process. Put simply, if something is easy to do, you'll feel good in the process but not care about the reward in the long term. You likely won't even create a memory of either the process or the reward because it's nothing special. But if something is difficult to do, you'll likely dislike the process of doing it, but then the long-term reward of having done it will have more intrinsic value to you, and the memory you create will be much more intense.
This was the moment in the video where I had to pause and take a moment and just sit back and think, damn, he has a point. When I earned my first epic in Everquest, it was one of those moments that I will kind of always remember. It still sticks with me to this day, and that was well over a decade ago. It required so many different people assisting me. It took so many hours, some of those hours just sitting and staring at a spawn spot. It wasn't exactly all fun. In fact, most of it was decidedly not fun. Most of it was decidedly grueling and something that I would not really want to spend my time on today. But that memory still exists. It is a powerful memory. But I also want to point out something here before we get too deep into this paradox. I want to talk about the importance of novelty. The difficulty alone is not the only reason why that memory is still present for me. It was the novelty of completing it for the first time. Because you see, in my time in EverQuest, I went back to the well over and over. Through progression servers and alternate characters, I went on to complete a second epic, and a third, and fourth, and fifth, etc. Each time the reward for doing it diminished, but the difficulty didn't. Some epics for different classes were more difficult than others, while others were easier. But it didn't really matter. As time went on with the game, these once epic quests became a necessity, something you just had to do. A checklist item, or more accurately, several checklist items that was no longer steeped in lore. It was a thing that you had to do, an annoying task if you wanted to play the game at a high level and raid and do things like that. These steep diminishing returns actually made the initial difficulty worse because the reward for accomplishing the task wasn't so monumental. It became more, are you done yet? Why haven't you finished this yet? It was just expected. Now you may say that this is just my personal experience, and yes, I can't speak to the entire player base of Everquest, but at least in the several guilds that I was in, and with the many friends I made in the game, none of them viewed these once epic quests as anything but annoying. Many would actually try and find out if they needed to do it, or if they could just wait until Epic 2.0s came out and do the much easier pre-quest. And here I want to say to anyone who plays a clear kind of progression server, my apologies and my condolences.
This is human nature. We want the easy and immediate, but we place much more long-term value on the completion of difficulty. Nobody wants to struggle, but everyone wants the feeling and satisfaction earned from struggling and succeeding. We don't enjoy the process of overcoming adversity, but we do grow from it. Indeed, the moments of unplanned struggle often become some of our fondest memories. It's very important to understand that the word struggle in this context is not life-changing trauma. It's not extremely negative experiences that you wish you could remove. It means less than optimal, unexpected. It means more difficult than you originally anticipated. It's not extremely damaging, it's challenging within the context of the game. If you go camping with your friends and everything is absolutely fine, you'll likely have an okay trip, but if on the second night it begins to absolutely pour with rain and you discover there's a rip in the tent, you will likely hate it in the moment, but look back on it fondly, laughing with the group as you all reminisce the struggle you overcame. It's often the moments of struggle that we look back on and smile about. We defeated the enemy and we see value in that. If you ask older MMO players some of their best memories, they'll often tell you about all the adversity they overcame, standing selling items in the Everquest tunnel or the Falador Bank, completing quests without guides, phoning friends in real life to organize a raid.
Now here, Josh Strife Hayes has done a great job explaining what at first glance might seem like a complex paradox in gaming. Essentially, what it boiled down to was a trade-off between two different types of satisfaction, short-term versus long-term. That the long-term satisfaction comes from struggle against adversity and overcoming it in gaming. That the feelings of achievement overpower the immediate negativity of inconvenience, at least when you're looking back at those memories. This perhaps is also why so many use nostalgia as an excuse for why older MMOs feel better. What I like here is that Josh Strife Hayes isn't necessarily saying that. He's not saying that we're ignoring the difficulty, but rather that the end goal was so satisfying because of it. It stood the test of time. That strife is what made those memories special in the first place. We aren't nostalgic for easy accomplishments because they weren't really accomplishments. In some ways, this flips the nostalgia argument on its head, because the struggle can't be forgotten, because it is a big part of what is making the accomplishments valuable in the first place. Now, before we go further, I want to get to the point where I disagree with Mr. Hayes. I want to go back to that example of EverQuest epics, because I think it adds to this argument by adding some important context. Many viewers of this channel specifically either perpetually return to EverQuest or play other games like it, like classic World of Warcraft. They seek out new games with the old school feel, like Embers Adrift, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, and even games I consider pseudo-classic inspired, like Ashes of Creation. There's a reason why they return, and why the cycle of EverQuest progression servers are powerful lures, and why P99 is successful. A not insignificant portion of the classic MMO players are content with the cycle of the very reasons Josh Strife Hayes is pointing out. But another portion, one that I consider myself to be a part of, has been looking for a new take on it for over a decade, and it comes back to those two things I mentioned at the outset. scarcity of achievement among other players, and repetition. The EverQuest Epic example showed diminishing returns in the long-term satisfaction from completing a difficult task. Not only was it something I'd personally achieved before, but as time went on and more players achieved it, thus diminishing it to the very to-do list type item many modern MMOs are accused of. If you solve the same problem again and go through every step, it's still an achievement, but less so. Epics in EverQuest came out about 22 years ago in EverQuest at this point, and for many that incredibly difficult feat is now a prerequisite. It has lost its luster. To many, it might not be any more impressive or rewarding than reaching maximum level in a newer MMO or hitting a high PvP rating in WoW arenas. It's not just the difficulty of these older games, but also the time and the place where they fit. This is why I think a new game with entirely different challenges of equal difficulty may fill that void for many players. It's why I have to hope for the challenge promised by new games like Embers Adrift, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, and Ashes of Creation, bringing back similar feelings of achievement like EverQuest, World of Warcraft Classic, and Ultima Online. But if Josh Strife Hayes' next point holds true, I may be completely wrong. And this is where I may have to disagree with him.
This paradox of adversity can be applied to lots of MMORPG design elements. There used to be fewer MMOs, so players had less choice, meaning you could make your game more difficult. You could add in more adversity, whether that's the difficulty of the enemies, the quests, or even understanding the systems the game is made up of. Players would have to conquer them, and so be given the reward for conquering them. Ironically now, if something is too difficult, players will leave and go to another MMO because there is so much choice. It is incredibly ironic that the design which sets up satisfaction, adversity, is also the design which drives players away.
So this for me is the big divergence. This is where I feel like I actually disagree with Josh Strife Hayes. I understand his points and they are very well made, but I have to look outside of the MMO genre here to kind of make my point. Difficulty can coexist with choice. We've seen that quite loudly lately with the Game of the Year awards going to Elden Ring, a game that is ostensibly very difficult, or even more generally the numerous players who choose hard difficulties when playing their video games. Now granted, these are going to be solo players, but they are still seeking out that challenge. But they have massive amounts of choice. There are easier games, and within that difficulty setting, you could go with the story mode in many cases. So why are people picking those difficult games? Well, it goes back to what Josh Strife Hayes was saying. That achievement, that feeling of achievement, that strife, that struggle leading to something that will be more memorable. Now, the problem with an MMO is that you cannot toggle the difficulty, leaving developers to decide on that setting before the game even launches. This, I think, is where Josh Strife Hayes' point makes sense about competition. One of the push factors for players in an MMO is that initial struggle. A lack of handholding can lead to early frustration and an unwillingness to push past it for the greater rewards beyond. To use Josh Strife Hayes' example of group finders, in 2022, if you have limited time, would you be more likely to sit in town spamming for a group, or would you prefer to be randomly grouped together in 3 minutes? As much as I would like to say the majority of us are fine with the labor involved in putting a group together, that's in part because we know of the later rewards of doing that. We've made friends in prior games this way, joined guilds, made memories, but that doesn't mean sitting in town for hours asking for a group is fun. It just means it might be worth it, and that we have an idea that it is. And honestly, that's a gamble that as a developer, it's hard to make because you're gambling with people's initial fun when, as Josh Strife Hayes says, there are other options. If I promise you $50 immediately, but someone else promises you $100 in a month, which are you more likely to take? The need for immediate satisfaction grows with competition, but I also think that's why we are in a state today in the genre where there are a lot of players out there lamenting taking that $50. Yes, there are a lot more MMOs out there today than there were in 1999 to 2004, but there are also more players. Before World of Warcraft, pop culture references to an MMO were rare. Hell, does anyone else remember seeing EverQuest and the New Kid and freaking out? Now you have major celebrities like Henry Cavill, Ronda Rousey, Vin Diesel, Jamie Lee Curtis, all talking about games like World of Warcraft. The genre is much larger than it was back then, and not just in the sheer number of titles, but in the way it has infiltrated the gaming space. Now, of course, it is still a small genre compared to, say, the Souls-like space, which is fond of difficulty, we'll say. Elden Ring, for example, sold 17.5 million copies in 2022 compared to just about 10 million for Final Fantasy XIV since it launched years ago, and 17 million for Guild Wars 2 since its launch. But in sum, many gamers enjoy difficulty and challenge, and while the gaming space, specifically for MMORPGs, has been inundated with options, those options have all tended to lean towards one way. So I think we have become oversaturated in this genre with that initial easier way to go, which is lacking that pull of that greater reward by struggling through the game. And so there may be a position now in the genre as it stands that is ripe for someone to come in and offer that experience once again. So I would suggest that players in 2023 are not quite as quick to abandon a game as we might think. The problem is just finding balance, finding how to best put forth that difficulty and put forth that reward. But that is a topic deserving of its own video. Thank you so much for joining me in this reaction video of one of my absolute favorite MMO content creators, Josh Strife Hayes. I have linked his video down below. Please go watch that video in its entirety. It is a absolutely excellent video, like essentially all of his videos are. And I really would appreciate if you go give a watch, because he makes some really good points throughout the entire video. And I obviously could not cover the entirety of the video here. But now I'd like to hear from you. Did you enjoy this? Did you enjoy this kind of response and analysis? Is it something that you would like to watch more of or not? I'm always looking to see what you find valuable, so please let me know down in the comment section below. And if you're feeling particularly nostalgic, I went into 5 things you will not ever see in an MMO again, right over here. So please take a look at that video. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.